The 2 a.m. decision that changed everything. What happened didn't look dramatic. There was no press conference, no televised address, no breaking news banner running across cable networks. In fact, most Americans woke up having no idea anything had even changed. But quietly, in the early hours of the morning, a decision was executed that would reshape how money could move to Americans, especially seniors. At 2 a.m., a moment chosen not for visibility but for finality, Donald Trump approved a $2,000 tariff dividend structure that did not come from Congress, did not rely on borrowing, and did not follow the familiar IRS stimulus pipeline. This wasn't political theater. This was execution. Timing matters in government. When leaders want attention, they speak during the day. When they want leverage, they leak information. But when they want something completed without interference, they act quietly after markets close and media cycles reset. That is exactly what happened here. This move was not framed as a stimulus check, and that distinction is critical. Stimulus implies debt, delay, and inflation blowback. What occurred at 2 a.m. was different. Money already collected, already sitting in the system, redistributed without adding a single dollar to the deficit. And once you understand that, one thing becomes clear. This was never just about a check. It was about changing the rules of how relief can reach people, starting with those who feel inflation first and hardest. Why this was not a stimulus? Check. One of the biggest mistakes people made when this news quietly surfaced was calling it a stimulus check. That label may sound familiar, but it completely misses what actually happened. Stimulus money follows a predictable path. Congress debates, borrowing increases, the IRS becomes the gatekeeper, and inflation pressure builds almost immediately. None of that applied here. This $2,000 tariff dividend did not come from newly created money. It came from tariff revenue that had already been collected, funds sitting inside the system untouched and unborrowed. That single fact changes everything. When the money already exists, Congress does not need to vote. There is no omnibus bill, no political bargaining, no last-minute amendments that delay delivery. Treasury already had the authority, and instead of announcing intentions or floating proposals, the confirmation made clear that the structure was approved and moved directly into execution. That distinction matters. Speculation happens in daylight. Execution happens quietly, often when the outcome is already locked in, because no new money was injected into the economy. This model avoids the inflation backlash that followed previous relief programs. Nothing expanded the deficit. Nothing passed through the traditional IRS stimulus machinery that has slowed payments for decades. This wasn't government spending in the usual sense. It was redistribution of existing revenue. Washington almost never crosses that line, which is why so many analysts underestimated the significance of this move. Calling it stimulus makes it sound ordinary. In reality, it was disruptive, not because of its size, but because of its structure. How seniors quietly moved to the front of the line. At first, this program was not designed with seniors at the center. The original assumption inside the system was familiar. Working households would feel tariff pressure first because they were actively earning, spending, and exposed to price shifts. On paper, that logic made sense. But the data told a different story. Almost overnight, priorities were rewritten. Seniors, especially those living on fixed incomes, were quietly moved from the background to the front of the line. There was no announcement, no press release, no political explanation, and that silence tells you something important. This change was not driven by optics. It was driven by numbers. Workers can adjust when prices rise. They can negotiate wages, change jobs, add hours, or take on overtime. Seniors cannot. When rent increases, when grocery bills spike, when prescription costs jump, there is no offset. The check is the check. Social Security, SSI, or SSDI payments do not stretch just because inflation does. Internal data finally forced an uncomfortable admission. Inflation was not cooling where it hurt the most. Fixed-income Americans were absorbing the shock first. That reality flipped the priority structure without fanfare. This wasn't charity. It was recognition, long overdue, of who was actually bleeding first. And once seniors were moved forward, the entire system had to change around them. What looked like a quiet administrative adjustment was, in reality, a fundamental shift in how need was being measured. Fixed income and the reality inflation statistics. Ignore for years, Americans have been told the same reassuring story. Inflation is cooling, prices are stabilizing, relief is on the way. But for seniors living on fixed income, that story never matched reality. And eventually, the data made that impossible to ignore. Food prices did not cool, utilities did not cool, rent did not cool, prescription costs certainly did not cool. Yet traditional inflation metrics spread pain across the entire population, averaging experiences that are not lived the same way. A working household and a retiree do not experience inflation equally. For someone living on $1,100 or $2,300 a month in Social Security income, inflation does not ease, it compresses. Every increase in cost suffocates something else. Groceries crowd out medications, rent crowds out utilities. There is no flexibility, there is no adjustment mechanism. Internal Treasury analysis finally reflected what seniors already knew. Inflation hits hardest where income cannot move. That insight forced the priority rewrite. If inflation were truly cooling where it mattered, there would have been no reason to quietly reshuffle recipients at 2 a.m. This decision was a silent admission that the public narrative no longer held up. Policy followed reality, not headlines. And once that happened, seniors were no longer treated as a secondary concern. They became the reference point. The system stopped asking who earns more and started asking who breaks first. And that single shift explains why this entire structure changed without warning, because the numbers left no other choice. The silent rebuild of the payment system. While most people were focused on the $2,000 figure, the most important change happened somewhere else entirely. Treasury did not just approve payments. It quietly rebuilt the entire distribution structure behind the scenes. A new three-tier system replaced the old flat assumptions that treated recipients as if they faced the same pressures. Tier 1 became the fast lane. Tier 2 slowed. Tier 3 moved into review-heavy territory. And here is where the shock landed. Low-income seniors, particularly those receiving Social Security, SSI, or SSDI, were placed directly into Tier 1. This was not because they earned more. It was because their income was less flexible. The system stopped ranking people by how much they made and started ranking them by how quickly rising prices could break them. That was the pivot. Many working households who expected early payments did not lose eligibility, but quietly, without announcement, they were moved further back in line. No headline warned them. No notification explained the shift. Some people woke up closer to the front. Others never realized the line had moved behind them. That silence matters. Political theater needs explanation. Triage does not. This was not a popularity contest. It was a calculation. And once that three-tier structure was locked in, speed became possible. Not because of new technology, but because of a decision to finally use the data that had always been there. This was not reform by debate. It was reform by execution. Why seniors were verified faster than anyone else. Once seniors were moved to the front of the line, the next question was speed. And this is where the system revealed something uncomfortable. Seniors were not just prioritized. They were verified faster than almost anyone else. The reason was simple. Their data already existed. The Social Security Administration already knew who they were. Benefit amounts were consistent, income sources were limited, addresses rarely changed. In many cases, the IRS already had decades of records. There was nothing new to collect. That meant Treasury did not need new applications. There were no fresh filings. Seniors were not asked to create accounts, submit documents, or jump through procedural hoops. Even seniors who do not file tax returns, traditionally the slowest group to receive payments, were no longer bottlenecked. SSA data bypassed the delays that plagued previous programs. Verification became administrative, not adversarial. And that distinction matters. When a system assumes fraud, it slows everyone down. When it assumes clarity, it moves. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The government was always capable of moving this efficiently. It simply chose not to. This time, automation was not a technology upgrade. It was a policy decision. Fewer steps, less friction, faster execution. When the goal is delivery, not optics, obstacles disappear. And for the first time in a long while, seniors were allowed to move without carrying the weight of the system on their backs. The fear seniors had, and the reassurance that followed. As news of the payment structure began to circulate, a familiar fear surfaced among seniors. Would this money interfere with Social Security? Would SSI or SSDI benefits be reduced later? Would accepting the payment trigger reviews, clawbacks, or future penalties? Those concerns were not irrational. Past programs taught seniors to be cautious. This time, however, United States Department of the Treasury was unusually clear, because it had to be. The $2,000 tariff dividend is not classified as income. It is not wages, it is not a benefit increase, and it is not folded into Social Security, SSI, or SSDI calculations. Instead, it is treated as a tariff rebate, money returned from existing trade revenue, not something earned or recurring. That classification matters. It means no impact on COLA, no benefit recalculation, no automatic reviews triggered by receipt of the payment. For SSI recipients, where rules are especially strict, this still sits outside income limits. Officials did quietly note one practical reality that has always existed. Holding large sums of cash indefinitely can affect certain asset-based programs, but that is not a penalty tied to this payment. It is a standing rule, unrelated to the dividend itself. For many seniors, that reassurance mattered as much as the money. The biggest fear turned out to be wrong, and in a system where uncertainty often causes harm, clarity became part of the relief. Why? This looked like a test, not a one-time event. Once the payment structure was in motion, a larger question quietly emerged. Was this simply a one-time response, or was something else being tested? The way this program was designed strongly suggested the latter. Governments do not rebuild distribution systems for a single moment. They build them to see if they work. And through this process, Treasury learned something critical. It can identify recipients, verify eligibility, prioritize need, and distribute funds quickly, without Congress and without disruption. Notice what this was not called. It was not branded as emergency relief. It was not labeled a one-time stimulus. The language was neutral, almost boring. That was intentional. Politically, it sent a signal without locking anyone into promises. Administratively, it proved the machine could run. This was a proof of concept, not a guarantee of repetition, but a demonstration of capability. Once a mechanism exists, it rarely disappears. No official promised expansions or future checks. Anyone claiming certainty there is misleading you. But systems built for speed are not built to be forgotten. For seniors, this mattered immediately. They felt the efficiency, they saw what happened when relief bypassed the usual bottlenecks, and once people experience that kind of delivery, expectations change. This was not framed as the end of the road. It looked far more like step one, a quiet staircase most people did not notice yet, but one that now clearly exists. A shift away from the IRS-centered pipeline. For decades, nearly every form of financial relief in the United States has followed the same path. Work produces income, income flows through the IRS. Redistribution follows after layers of review, delay, and political negotiation. What happened here broke from that pattern. This money did not come from labor. It came from imports, from tariffs on foreign goods entering the country. That distinction may sound technical, but it is profound. Americans did not need to earn more hours or file new paperwork to access this relief. The funds already existed. Before income taxes became dominant, tariffs were a primary source of federal revenue. This move did not attempt to erase the modern tax system, but it did something important. It redirected attention. For the first time in a long while, money reached Americans without the IRS acting as the central gatekeeper. For seniors, the difference was immediate. No tax filing requirement, no waiting on IRS processing cycles, no refund-style delays. Relief moved through administrative channels already built around their lives, not their earnings. This was not about ideology. It was about friction. When relief bypasses the IRS pipeline, it moves faster, cleaner, and with less political contamination. Workers noticed it, seniors felt it, and once people see that an alternative path exists, one that delivers without chaos, they do not forget it. The system was not replaced, but it was no longer the only option. Why silence was the strategy. Many people wondered why this decision arrived without fanfare. No countdown clocks, no public rollout, no headlines explaining every detail in advance. That silence was not accidental. It was strategic. Markets react to noise. Media cycles distort nuance, and premature attention invites interference. A daytime rollout would have triggered speculation, misinformation, and political pressure before execution was complete. By acting first and speaking later, Treasury kept control of the process. There was also a practical reason rarely discussed. The louder the announcement, the faster fraud follows, especially when seniors are involved. Scammers monitor public signals closely. Delaying attention until structures were locked reduced the window for exploitation. Silence removed pressure. No forced promises, no escalation traps, no public commitments that could be weaponized later. Execution before reaction allowed the system to move without chaos. This is why the timing mattered. 2 a.m. is not about secrecy. It is about finality. When something moves quietly in the dark, it is often because it is already done. The loudest government moves are often the weakest. They rely on persuasion. This one did not. It relied on structure. And by the time most people heard about it, the machinery was already running, which is exactly how sensitive processes are protected. The scam risk that always follows: real money. Anytime real money is about to move, something else moves even faster. Scammers and officials inside United States Department of the Treasury were blunt about this reality behind the scenes. There will be fake phone calls claiming to be from the IRS. There will be text messages pretending to come from the Social Security Administration. There will be emails promising to speed up payments or verify eligibility. None of those are real. Treasury will never call you. They will never text you. They will never ask for your Social Security number, bank login, or a processing fee. Urgency is the weapon. Fear is the hook. Scammers know seniors are watching closely, and they exploit moments exactly like this, when relief is real, but details are still unfolding. The real process is quiet, it is boring, it is administrative. Ironically, that is how you know it is legitimate. Real payments do not demand action, they arrive. Every legitimate check creates 1,000 fake ones. That has always been true. Protecting this relief now requires vigilance. If a message demands immediate response or personal information, it is not help, it is theft. Staying alert is no longer optional. It has become part of safeguarding the relief itself, especially for seniors who have already carried enough risk. What is confirmed and what is not. As attention grows, it becomes critical to separate confirmation from speculation. There are facts that are locked in, and there are claims that are not. Confusing the two creates false expectations, something seniors cannot afford. What is confirmed is this: the eligibility structure is complete. The prioritization tiers are set, and the United States Department of the Treasury is executing the distribution. This is no longer theoretical. The machinery is moving. What is not confirmed are promises of repeat payments, expansions, or permanent replacements of existing systems. Anyone claiming certainty there is misleading you. No guarantees were made, no schedules were announced, and no commitments were locked in beyond this execution. This distinction matters. Framing this as generosity or a rescue would be inaccurate. It was framed as acknowledgement that inflation hit fixed incomes first, that seniors absorbed the earliest pressure, and that the old pipeline was not working. By avoiding exaggerated language, officials reduced political risk and public misunderstanding. The structure was designed to function, not to inspire. For seniors, clarity is protection. Knowing what this is and what it is not prevents unnecessary fear and false hope. And in a system where confusion often causes harm, precision became part of the policy itself. Why this was framed as acknowledgement, not rescue. One of the most revealing aspects of this move was how carefully it was framed. This was not sold as a rescue package, it was not described as emergency relief, and it was not marketed as generosity. That language was avoided on purpose. Instead, this action was framed as acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that inflation hit fixed incomes first. Acknowledgement that seniors, especially those relying primarily on Social Security, felt pressure long before official data admitted it. An acknowledgement that the existing delivery system was no longer aligned with reality, that framing matters. Rescue implies failure. Generosity implies charity. Acknowledgement implies correction. It signals that something was misread and that policy is adjusting to reflect what has already happened on the ground. By choosing this language, officials avoided locking themselves into political promises. They also avoided triggering expectations that could not be guaranteed. This was not about solving inflation or rewriting the tax code overnight. It was about recognizing who was carrying the burden first. For seniors, that distinction was deeply important. Being acknowledged is different from being pitied. It means the system finally saw what they were experiencing and responded without spectacle. This was not a victory lap. It was a quiet course correction. And those kinds of corrections tend to matter far longer than announcements that fade with the news cycle. Why this did not end. Inflation, but changed the line. It is important to be clear about what this action did and what it did not do. This decision did not end inflation. It did not lower prices overnight. And it did not rewrite the tax system in a single move. Anyone suggesting that is overstating the impact. But it did something just as meaningful. It proved that the line could move. For years, the assumption was that relief had to follow a rigid order, slow, politicized, and clogged with friction. This moment showed that prioritization could change quietly, efficiently, and without chaos. Seniors were not told to wait their turn. Their turn was moved forward. That matters because systems teach behavior. Once people see that delivery can happen without endless delay, expectations shift. What once felt inevitable no longer does. The old order stops looking permanent. This was not a solution. It was a signal that structure matters more than speeches, that execution matters more than headlines, and that when data forces a decision, policy can still move, even if no one is watching. For seniors, the takeaway was not hope built on promises. It was confidence built on proof. The system did not collapse. It adapted, and that adaptation, quiet as it was, may end up being the most important part of the story. Why what happened at 2 a.m. was only the beginning. When you step back and look at the full picture, one thing becomes clear. What happened at 2 a.m. was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a different way of thinking about relief. This action did not promise permanence, it did not guarantee repetition, and it did not pretend to fix every problem seniors face. What it did was prove something simple but powerful. The system can move when it chooses to. For decades, many Americans were told delays were unavoidable, complexity was necessary, and friction was permanent. This moment quietly challenged that belief. Seniors saw what happened when data, structure, and execution aligned. Relief arrived without chaos, without debt, without spectacle. That does not mean the road ahead is easy. Inflation remains real, costs remain high, and uncertainty has not disappeared. But something shifted. The idea that seniors must always wait, that they must always absorb pressure first and relief last, no longer looks inevitable. This was not framed as generosity because it was not about kindness. It was about acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that fixed incomes break first. Acknowledgement that old pipelines no longer fit modern reality. And acknowledgement that when priorities are corrected, systems respond. Nothing about this guarantees what comes next. But once people see that the line can move, they never unsee it. Expectations change, accountability changes, and quiet execution begins to matter more than loud promises. That is why what happened at 2 a.m. deserves attention, not as a headline, but as a signal. This was not the end. It was step one.